So welcome everyone. I'm going to be presenting a little bit about my thoughts on epistemics and how it relates to some of the work that's been going on around forecasting. I'm Ozzie, this is Lynch. I'm just going to start presenting and then I'll get hopefully a lot of intense criticism and feedback. So we'll see how that goes. Sound
Yeah,
good?
yeah. I just try to be the everyman, I guess, in this conversation.
You had 10 minutes to look at the presentation, so I'm sure you have like oodles of ideas at this point. So
yeah, totally.
yeah, definitely. And this is all very rough, as is obvious. Great. So you can see my screen.
Yep.
Great. So yeah, the main thing here is there's been a lot of discussion about forecasting. Forecasting. There's like forecasting money. There's like people trying to specialize in forecasting, and I'm a bit worried about that. I want to make sure that we're optimizing the right thing, and kind of shift the conversation a bit to what I'm calling epistemics. I'm not sure what the terminology should be, but this is like one option.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Take a step back. But
Yes.
yeah, focus area. Like how large are you thinking? Like relative to other things?
So I think it's pretty large. So it would like encompass institutional decision making. It would encompass forecasting. It would encompass a few other things.
Mm-hmm.
I think that ask me this again if I don't respond to it in a few slides when it has prioritization as another bullet.
Sounds good.
Right. That's one reason why I said focus area instead of cause area, because maybe it's bigger. There's been a lot of cause areas promoted. Recently, there's one about epistemic institutions as a cause area. So focus area, possibly bigger. Though the details don't matter too much.
Sure.
This is all very broad. So audience and status quickly. So this is very much geared towards effective altruists. If you don't know what effective altruism is and you're watching this, I recommend you look a little bit to read about those first. This is also very rough and the terminology is developing. So that's one reason why the slides are exactly as bad as they are. Yeah, I made this quickly and like the idea of trying to make more things like this quickly. I'm kind of aiming for an audience of I have about 10 to 30 people in mind as like the main people at this point. And then I hope to like write up some of these ideas and maybe those people will tell them to other people. So that's kind of what I'm aiming for. It's like it's supposed to be rough. And as such, I recommend other people make rough videos because typically I think there's like this arms race. I also would say quickly that I shouldn't talk so quickly. I talk quickly when I'm in a situation that people can't speed up my talk, right? But if you're watching this and find my talk slow, then do speed it up. You could use video speed controller on Chrome or Firefox to increase it over 2x.
Yeah, alternatively, if you think Ozzie is talking too quickly, you could also do like 0.5x.
Yeah, you could slow it down.
Extremely underused feature, as far as I could tell.
Yeah, probably, yeah. Cool, so what's wrong with forecasting? So to start off, I'm gonna talk about this idea of reification. So reification is like one of those terms that gets thrown around by, I think, Marx and a bit in continental philosophy. Yeah, it's used like, the concretization of something that's abstract. So something abstract becomes more concrete. But a definition that I like more, that I've been thinking about, is more of path dependency over time. So this is something I'd like to draw out in a lot of examples, but I think there are a whole bunch of cases where some ideas start out as ideas for a group of people, and then they try writing those ideas down. And then soon enough, huge decisions are made based on details that they didn't actually think were that important, right? Yeah. So there's this book, this is about like the danger of categories and like how bad they could be, especially if they're the wrong categories. So Sorting Things Out is one of the better books that I found about this topic. And one of the things that they talk about in the book is how few books there are in that topic. It just seems to be a bit of a neglected area from what I could tell. And it's by an anthropologist, or like I think the people, at least Jeffrey is an anthropologist, basically, and is more around the continental philosophy side of things. So I'd love to see like more analytical and like, numeric approaches to such things. But it talks a lot about medicine, for instance, where there are very important categorical distinctions. Or like in psychology, deciding who is actually sick and what sick means is like a very controversial area, kind of rightly so. Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I think like there's something weird about like ADHD being, or like many other disorders just being like it's like scientifically defined almost as a clear cutoff. But like if you look at the actual, well, maybe not scientifically defined, but it's like culturally defined that way. But if you look at the actual thing that happens, it's, ex- roughly the symptoms are like some like distribution that's not like too far away from normal or log normal, and then like like X percentile above that, like get access to medication, doctors, but also are given this label, and like all the percentiles below that are not, and that seems pretty weird. um S-
yeah,
Scott Alexander also has some stuff about like depression, anxiety, and like how, and like a bunch of other things where like the the clusters are not that natural or something, that you can imagine some of these like mental health disorders, like so like this is like not like saying who has one, but just like condition upon that being true, like where do you draw the ontologies, and it seems pretty, yes, I guess I mostly agree with
yeah,
this
yeah.
right now.
Yeah, so it's very complicated. One of the examples that it points out to with psychology is just the fact that like, homosexual started out as like a disease according to some of the standards, right?
Hmm.
And then that was a pretty big important thing to change. So categories have historically been used in ways that have damaged minorities, right?
Hmm.
And there's like a long history there. But even outside of that, it just seems to cause chaos wherever it goes. So for instance, like one term that I hate now is like um, uh, people like use capitalism in such weird ways, right? Like capitalism both means like a very specific economic way of doing things, but it also means like what's going on and all this crazy stuff that's happening, and people are railing against capitalism, but are they railing against what's going on, or are they railing against like the foundational economic principles? It's not super obvious, but that's actually a smaller deal than what I would say is something like the distinctions of, say, communism, right? Like communism started out with like a few set of ideas that just kind of happened to go together. I mean, there are definitely like some good reasons for some of it, but I'm sure a lot of it was circumstantial. And then several generations later, not only do these ideas get advanced, but people really buy into all the specifics of them, even though a lot of the specifics that they end up buying into were things that were just like very um, like circumstantial in the beginning. And now you have people identifying with these like pretty circumstantial things. In academia, I think that the lines between the fields is like very important and winds up like, I'm sure that if you there would have been so many ways to categorize things differently, and that would have led to just like very different behaviors. It seems like anthropologists have not just different focus areas but different practices than economics, for instance.
Yeah.
And like it seems like people have taken their categories and like you know um, run with them in very strange ways. Um, so yeah, it's very important to get categories correct if you can. And it's also important, hopefully, to like, so similar to reification, I call it like, or, there's a term de-reification. Are you still there? Um, so on reification and de-reification, which is a bit, I believe, where we were. So with the forecasting community right now, I think what I'm like cautiously worried about is that people will start, and it seems like I've been talking to like a bunch of youngish people who are interested in forecasting, and some of them are thinking about getting PhDs around forecasting, right? They're planning their careers around what's now forecasting. So we could imagine forecasting being reificated, basically, or reified, where we start setting up agreements that people will fund forecasting efforts. It becomes an official cause area. People like are getting jobs and are trying to set their careers up to do forecasting. But then that'd be a problem if there were other very important things that weren't getting funded because no one wants to do it because it's not forecasting. So for instance, like having great terminology is like obviously useful for forecasting purposes.
Yeah.
Forecasting could only get like so far, I think, without just better terms, right? Um, and hypothetically, someone could get a PhD in just like terminology, basically, or they get it in like knowledge graphs or some way to say like, I'm going to get very good at just understanding how categories should be done for other people to be forecasting on, right?
Yeah.
But it would be kind of awkward if you're doing that because it's not technically for a lot of people would say, oh, that's not forecasting. So people may be very hesitant to take that risk in their career, because they may think that like no one will want to fund them because they're not doing forecasting work. So that's like a very simple example. So de-reification, of course, is kind of like me saying stop with all of the forecasting stuff a bit, or like let's rethink this. Like forecasting is great. Another quick note: by forecasting would typically mean like judgmental, focused forecasting.
Yeah.
But we should think about, you know, not get too close-minded quite yet.
I'm a bit confused about this verification thing.
Yeah.
I think like there's something about like
Yeah.
ontologies being really good and ontologies being good even though they don't perfectly capture reality or something.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about like, so there's that element, right? Like, you know, like standards are good, like, you know, I think like seeing like a state has a bunch of examples, and I'm sure other places have a bunch of examples where like metrics are, like metrics have negative consequences, but like it would still be like, as I'm sure you probably agree, it would still be like kind of surprising if like having a standard measurement of like distance or like weight is not better than the reverse, even though like it, you know, it doesn't capture the fullness of reality or something.
So yeah, I'm not saying at all that it's bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
There could be very good reification. Like you could say that like the First Amendment, like freedom of speech, was like very great reification. Like that was kind of like an abstract idea becoming a pretty big deal legally and in a bunch of different ways. And that was like a positive example. And with categories, like I think we kind of need categories. There's kind of no way around it.
Yeah.
So like we could acknowledge that they're dangerous and powerful, and like try to understand the possible bads that we could do, so that when we like do build them, which we need to do, and I think hopefully we could build a whole lot more categories, we could kind of, you know what we're getting into.
Yeah. I think that the object level example, it does seem kind of scary that people like, I don't know how many people you're talking to, like if like a significant number of people are doing PhDs and planning their careers in forecasting. On the other hand, like if they're doing that, I don't know, if you're doing a PhD in forecasting and it turns out like it's not a particularly valuable thing to do, at least, you know, that's like one of the better things to specialize in to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean you would do a lot worse for sure. I'm just saying that like
Yeah.
there's like a continued conversation to try to improve things, right?
Yeah. The other hesitation I have is something about like, and I think this is just like possibly due to my lack of understanding of history. It's just like how successful attempts to do this like top down is relative to like figuring out something narrow and then expanding or something like that, or like with the verification it would just be like, you know, having messy ontologies and then improving it rather than like thinking that like you can actually just get the right ontology top down, like I don't know,
Yeah, no,
XACD comic and stuff.
I mean, this is definitely something I've been thinking about and would like to write more about. I think there is a broad spectrum of how you could go about the categorization and like ideation process, right? And some of the methods, I'm thinking about, in one of my Facebook posts, I had it as like lexical anarchy, right? Which is like the principle that yes, people should come up with their own definitions and terminology, but they just have to accept that other people will like then redefine their stuff, and that's totally fine, right?
Yeah.
So there are a lot of approaches to it. I think the thing I'm concerned about is just that we're kind of intentional about it, and we understand the issues, and then we kind of like carefully think through some of this. And this is also arguably a part of epistemics, right? Like a lot of epistemics is like using the right words, because there are probably some words that we could know and use that would just lead us way astray, and others that would generally, like I think, guide us in a better direction. There's of course a lot of debate, controversy over some of the details I don't want to get into because it's a whole topic, let alone if just one topic, right? It's kind of all over the place.
Sure.
Yeah. So some things that are useful to forecasting, of course, like terminology is great, ontology. So just, I don't want to get too much in the weeds. And then translation, I'm calling it, which is in a post I'll probably give another talk about. Basically just like, in order to forecast, you have to know, right? You have to like know what you're doing. And translation kind of plays a hand in that, as I'm defining it. So looking a bit into what's being reified, we could kind of say, fancy words. It's really not, it shouldn't be that fancy. 80,000 hours on their list, they have like improving decision making as like the closest thing, I think. So there's global priorities research, but that's typically more focused on prioritization. But what about the things that lead to prioritization? So GPI as a group, they do some stuff around epistemics, but that's not considered one of the other things. It's kind of like lumped in, but hypothetically it could be its own thing.
Yeah, also philosophy. Yeah, I was gonna say like philosophy is also like something that.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say that like arguably like, a lot of philosophers were basically doing epistemics, or they were doing things that would lead to our abilities to improve our decision making and
Mhm.
like, yeah. So they were very much doing this. So you could make the argument that maybe like things like that are just like way too difficult and should be done by the rest of society. But I think, there is a very realistic question here. And then
Yeah.
on improving decision making, to me, and what I typically hear is that that's like, we know what's good. We just have to make sure that other big institutions use the right decision making processes, which just kind of has a lot of intuitions built into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You could also make the argument that we have no clue what's going on. We're just like scratching the surface. We like a few things kind of seem good to us. In which case, the important thing to do isn't improving our decision making a bit. It's like, oh shit, we need to like really take a step back here, and maybe there's just like a whole lot of work to like really rethink a lot of things.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty confused here. Like, I think like in the abstract, like file mode, I totally agree with like this like very strong cluelessness mode or something.
Yeah,
It just feels like, oh man, everything looks hard and stuff like that. But then like I'm going on Neo mode, and I'm like, like if I were to bet like 50 years from now, like why I think that, like how, like what do I think is the probability that I think we're just massively wrong about like AI risk or like bio risk. I don't feel like super compelled by that story or something.
yeah. I think that this is something I'd love to look, to
Mhm.
see more thought on. Like
Yeah.
AI risk is very new to a lot of EA in a lot of ways, right? We're talking about like
Mhm.
the last 10 years where there's been a huge shift.
Yeah, yeah. And then like
Yeah.
what you want is something like base rates or something. Like how often are people like, oh wow, this exciting thing is like, we've thought about it in the last 10 years. We're like, wow, this is really exciting. And this is the most important thing. And how often what those wrong, at least within the field or something.
Yeah.
Uh,
Another thing you could say is that the people who came up with those ideas, there were just kind of a few people back then, right?
mhm,
And now we have like all these new people entering EA and we have more money to like fund new people, right? So
mhm,
we probably have the capacity to do like 10 to 1,000x as much research into things like this than we used to. So even if it gets more difficult to find new things, we have some tooling. And then if we're able to improve our efficiency another like 10 to 100x, maybe like 1,000 or more with like AI, then we may have cause to believe that it's viable to find much better answers, basically.
mhm.
Um, yeah. So yeah, I think some people may say like, oh, we figured it out, just AI, bio, a few other things. Maybe there's like a small cause X, it'll be like 10%, but we're good to go. That is very much an open question. So this is kind of how I see it working, that like epistemics basically helps prioritization, and prioritization tells us what causes to work on. Right now, most of the cause areas are over here, right? There's like
Yeah.
not that much prioritization. I'd love to see more prioritization. That's something that's been talked about more recently. But even before prioritization is epistemics, arguably. And epistemics is basically like kind of meta prioritization, according to this. That's, and then
Yeah.
forecasting is like part of epistemics. So,
Maybe I'm being like too
go ahead.
maybe I'm being too narrow here, but I imagine like the actual sense, like there's a bunch of feedback loops or something. Like it's not like a directed graph the way you're portraying it.
Definitely. Like all graphs are huge simplifications, basically.
Sure, sure. But I guess
Um, yeah.
like when I try to think about like how do I uh how do I like answer a question or something, like, just very concretely, like I'm attacking this question, it's like some combination of like sometimes like I just really know like what things to look at, and then I look at those things, and then like occasionally I'll be like, oh oof, I'm missing some big spot, big thing where I'm like looking at it this way, and then go back and like, try to like have more of a beginner's mindset, or like more of like I'm confused what's going on. And some questions I'm just like I just start with like I'm really confused what's going on,
Yeah.
and then I try to branch outwards. And I think maybe this analogy doesn't map perfectly, but like I'm confused what's going on seems like somewhere in the epistemic stage or something. I mean, yeah, it's not perfect, right? But I think you roughly get what I mean. Where sometimes it's like substantial feedback loops.
Yeah, I think kind of. I guess like a lot of the time I'm imagining people doing things like that. I kind of see it being in the prioritization stage. And then like epistemics would be more like the meta of like improving your process. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I guess prioritization implies something like, to me, it implies something like I have a bunch of questions to look at, and like I'm just trying to allocate resources among those questions. But maybe you're thinking it as like already a bit more abstract.
I think maybe like a better word for it is something like prioritization is, I was kind of thinking about like generalist research or something, right? Like
Mm.
there's kind of like this cluster of things that we just need to throw like smartish talent that's domain general a bit. And right now the main thing is prioritization. And that's like between causes and also within causes.
So, for example, like world modeling, like
Yeah.
or like understanding the world, would you count that as prioritization more than epistemics?
Yeah, I think it gets a bit tricky. It's not exactly where the like epistemics are kind of what helps prioritization. So if there are some things that are like meta, like high level prioritization that helps a lot of other prioritization, then it's not obvious right now where to draw the line. Right?
Got it.
I'd say if like Robin Hanson type work of like understanding where human brain, or like a lot of economics and psychology, trying to understand like how brains are biased in ways that that could improve our decision making. I
Mm,
would put that more into the epistemics category.
that makes sense. So, like, so if you're focused on the world, a lot of this things would be like under prioritization, or if it's sufficiently specific beyond the direct causes. But if it's more like the lens of how we see the world, then you'll mostly put that on the epistemics.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And you could also say like maybe epistemics, or like what's in this bucket now is like all the tooling um, that you would use to do a lot of prioritization, right? So if you got like could get a degree for prioritization, a lot of the classes that you'd be taking are basically epistemics, and then your the non-epistemics classes would be ones like, oh, let's just understand how prioritization is done in this very specific field, right? Which is different from like let's understand how to do prioritization to begin with, which involves like I could also give a lot of examples sometimes, like Bayesian reasoning, a lot of philosophy, arguably a lot of mathematics is more in the epistemic side. Um,
Sure.
yeah, it's a big potential area, but of course, what we care about and when we talk about it, we're looking very specifically at the parts that are interesting for us to improve, right?
Yeah.
Which is not the foundations of math. It's much more like ways that we could, yeah, take things to be better for prioritization. Um, So this is like a very high level diagram that within epistemics, there are a lot of ways to chunk up epistemics. One of them is to look at the parts that are collective epistemics. And the forecasting that we've been talking about is judgmental forecasting. And when you say talking about, I mean um, that a lot of EAs have been paying attention to for like Metaculus, a good judgment project, or things like that. And there are other fields that kind of cross with the two that are kind of interesting. So education is one that'll be in a future blog post, or it's in a blog post, but I'll may give another talk about it. So these are a few categories I just want to spend a bit of time on that do seem like things that I could imagine one calling epistemics. So the first is ontology design, or actually I'll just like start with judgmental forecasting, right, which we discussed. I could cross that out. The next one is ontology design. I don't know the best word for it. There are existing fields of like information architects, which is a bit old school, but basically having good terminology, having it all written out, making sure it's like a lot of work. Um, Cultural change is one that seems significant. So basically, if you have a culture where no one wants to know the truth and everyone's like embarrassed about their status, then they may be very hesitant to gain information about that, right? So I think Bridgewater is like the go-to example of a culture that is very candid, and that helps it arguably in terms of truth-seeking abilities, right? So it's possible that in order to have better epistemics as a group, one of the most important things is that we have a culture that is more privy to that, right?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. My impression right now is that EA culture is not like Bridgewater. And it's also that even Bridgewater probably has a ways to go in terms of, compared to the ideal, like, you know, epistemic Buddha state or something where people are just like
Oh,
totally honest and understand all their own faults and all of that stuff. So yeah,
yeah.
it's possible that's just like a massive amount of work, but it is definitely a thing to be talking about. Data engineering, just very classic, just we need to organize data. I imagine that seems to be what's cost effective for a lot of organizations, right? Like a lot of organizations with prediction pipelines just have a lot of data infrastructure going on. So yeah, I think there's good evidence to suggest that. There's also like Faunalytics, I think, which is like the animal group
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is just doing data, right? It makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
Taking a step back, I think like this,
Yeah.
there's not a clear line where ontology design ends and data engineering begins. At least there's like a pretty
Yeah.
large overlap in some ways, I guess.
I think the way I'd classify it is something like, so information architects are typically very different than engineers, but
Mm.
sometimes like you'd have engineering architects as being basically the same things, right? But just like a bit. So one of the main jobs of an engineering architect sometimes in some organizations is to like talk to the end users and figure out what the data model is going to be.
Right, right.
And in that case, they're basically doing ontological design.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other cases where the information designer or architect, so library sciences is one of the main fields that is connected to that, right? And a lot of that is connected to UX design. So, I mean, there's a bit in the weeds, but
I
like
did not know
often,
that.
oh, sure, sure. No, it's an interesting area. I'm kind of like disappointed that a lot of information architecture that I have seen isn't very numeric. I think they use something called card sorting to get a sense of, yeah, they use like some humanistic qualitative techniques typically. Um, but I think that there's a lot of interesting work to be done there, right?
Mhm.
Um, great. So, but in the scheme of things, compared to collective epistemics, which is a field I'm the most excited about for multiple reasons, there could be a lot of, I'm sure there are a bunch of other things that we're not paying attention to.
Mhm.
We're not trying to find something that's like a complete representation, just more like the main clusters that we should be keeping in mind when
Yeah.
optimizing, right? So yeah, I mean, the next thing is like epistemics can mean so many things. There are just so many ways to look at it. I just wanted to like spend a little bit of time outlining a few axes that you could consider. And I just have two, but there are a bunch of others that I've been thinking about. And then there are a bunch of like clusters within that. So maybe like decision making is like a cluster that we want to pay extra attention to, of course.
Mhm.
I mean, it probably is because we've been doing it. But one of the axes is incremental progress versus like radical or futurist progress. So here you could call it radical epistemics or futurist epistemics. Um, incremental epistemic progress would be something like, new features on less wrong or guesstimate or these other tools, right?
Mhm.
That like we could do in the very short term. And then radical is something more like, what would be kind of crazy, assuming you have 10 to 40 years ahead of us. Um, and obviously, like the radical stuff gives us a lot more potential, but it's also going to take more time and stuff.
Yeah. Can you give like rather than a futuristic example, can you give like a historical example? Like how big is radical? Are we talking about like the internet level big, or are we talking like Wikipedia level, or like smaller than that?
I mean, I'd say that it's a spectrum. So maybe like Wikipedia is like midway between these two,
Oh, interesting.
and then the internet is like over here or something.
Mm. But
The
you think
internet, yeah,
the internet isn't that extreme? As like a
it kind of depends on what time period you're thinking about. So if you're coming at it from like the 1950s or like 1970s, then the internet's probably not like that extreme compared to where you are. If you're thinking about the internet from like the 1800s, it's probably pretty extreme.
oh wow. I was imagining like I
Yeah.
was thinking like the entire way people think about the world is I don't know, from like two generations back just seems substantively different.
Oh.
Or maybe I'm
Yeah,
just like neo-moding too much and or like
yeah,
inside viewing too much. But it just seems like a way about where you think about the world where like by default information is not available or like information is hard to access or any like short-term question that you have like you basically just you go by priors or by memory or something versus a world where by default like information is like something easy like easy information so to speak where like factual knowledge is like within a few seconds away. I think
yeah.
this is just like a intuitively that just seems pretty different and at least when I talk to people who are not super internet-y, that
Yeah.
seems like a different way that they look at the world. But maybe again, like maybe I'm just like way too inside viewing, and actually the real difference is, like some not so small differences.
I mean, I think that the internet was obviously like a tremendous deal, and it could also show. Um, I've been working on another document that's related, of course, um, the epistemic development one, basically trying to investigate some of this. We could say that the internet has been probably counterfactually responsible for probably a fair bit of EA progress, right? And
Yeah,
probably our epistemic improvements. But that said, I think we have a huge way to go, right? Like in the scale of things, I'm not sure if our academic departments have like improved that much since the internet. Like it just feels like um, we're still incorrect a whole lot. And then some people, of course, would say that there's been a lot of degradation with regards to social media and stuff. Um,
sure.
so it's complicated, but I would really hope that most of the progress is ahead of us. That's kind of how I see things going, or at least like when I look at what could be done, it feels like we just are very much scratching the surface.
Interesting.
Yeah. But this is also like a big topic, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, like I'm personally interested in this side, in part because that's also where I have a comparative advantage. But I think the whole thing definitely could, yeah, is useful to talk about. There's also the fact that like incremental work is often useful to understanding the potential of radical and futuristic work, right?
Yeah,
So incremental is also great. Yeah, there are big questions about how we want to like go about promoting and improving on epistemics. Like maybe we just want a whole bunch of incremental projects. Maybe we want like a bunch of futuristic explorations, or maybe we want like a mix of both. My guess is like some mix.
yeah. Sorry, what's the
Yeah,
last time, like, what's the example of radical or futurist thing that happened in the past? Like, I don't know,
yeah,
development of, like, the Enlightenment, maybe? Yeah, what's
yeah.
like if the internet's like only like two-thirds of the way or something? Like what would be like most of the way, or like
Yeah, I think
5/6 of
so.
the way?
Transhumanism. Um, let me think. I mean, it's complicated. I'd say that like, I mean,
I guess if we go really extreme with development of language, but I mean, presumably that was done incrementally.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, you could say that like, yeah, if you would have looked at how exciting things were once we had language compared to before we did, or like, when it was like very much starting, that itself was like a very big transition.
Yeah,
Um, I guess like when I look back on like how much we've improved epistemically since Socrates, um, I just don't know as much about philosophers before Socrates, of course. It doesn't feel like it's as big as it could be between like definitely us and AGI, right? Um, like personally, like I guess like another test of this is like if we took people from today and put them back in the time of Socrates, but maybe gave them some of the tools, would they be able to like outsmart everyone, right? And
interesting.
they would in some ways, but I'm not like if you ask them like, oh, can you prioritize this warfare battle that much, right? I feel like, or like if you took a group of them to focus on collective epistemics, I'm not sure how much better they could do. They could probably do a better job if you took maybe just say like 10 Bridgewater analysts, and then like had them compete with like a few of the Greeks in those days, like how much better could they have done?
Yeah, I think it's kind of
Yeah,
complicated because a lot of like epistemics is like situational or something. or like I don't know, the example I'm most familiar with is, like the one I thought about a bunch is like a lot of our, like some of our tools in some ways are like built on like a paradigm where math was the primary way to understand the universe or something. And then like depending on the field, like some of this hasn't updated for 21st century where like computation is the primary way to understand the world. Like the relative price of pure math and computation has massively changed by like many orders of magnitude since like the earlier 20th century. And like the analogy here is something like Bridgewater analysts are used to a world where they have access to computers and access to a bunch of other and like thinking and like depending on like the question, maybe access to specialists that they could contact now. So like to the degree that they're good at solving questions may not be like super relevant to like classical warfare or whatever things were like debated then.
So one thing that could be interesting to do is if you were to try to take the Bridgewater all their tools and say like how sensitive is each one to like their effectiveness in this like Greek warfare, right? Like it could be that almost all the benefit, like they do have a big benefit, but all of it comes from data, basically. Like they just have,
Right.
we'd kind of assume that they have the same data that they would today, which means that they'd have a huge data advantage. But if you remove that, then what's left, like I mean, maybe like they have higher IQ because of the Flynn effect, but that's kind of cheating, right? Although I mean, arguably, like if we could improve that, intelligence of people, that would lead to better epistemics, or many ways that you could, to describe it. Or if you could just like find better, smarter people, or like people who are less
Right.
biased, that would improve.
I mean, they have 2,000 years of history on like, I guess that is kind of data. Sorry, maybe
Yeah.
that's
But
depends on how you define data. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting topic. I think though that so the transhumanists kind of come to mind, and like the people who were excited in the beginning of the internet, because I think some of them were like very idealistic about how things would go, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you could say like the technocrats also were pretty idealistic, but probably not expecting that much because they weren't really expecting the I mean, I'm talking about like the early 1900s technocrats. I don't think they were expecting the internet, so I imagine a lot of the cool stuff is going to happen between the internet and AI and stuff. So yeah, this is a great topic to go more into detail with. But there are some of the questions I'm interested in, like how good can we expect things to possibly get, right? Like how much money could it take? I think from where I'm sitting, it kind of feels like this is like kind of audacious, but it kind of seems like maybe we really have a huge amount to gain that may be quite possible in the next 50 to 100 years, even outside of like AGI. So like AI improves, but it may be possible that we could just get a huge amount better, like much more than the internet has helped us, right? We could like do that like 10 to 1,000 times or something. And then in that case, the futurism, what would be expecting is not society is like what are typically conveyed in science fiction, but society is kind of like those, but where the epistemics are just awesome. So people always come to the kind of correct conclusions, and everyone kind of agrees with each other. And there's kind of some fun work I think to be done with like epistemic futurism in terms of just like fleshing out what societies with like just amazing level epistemics would even look like, right? But my guess is it would be like pretty freaking intense, and just like just very effective. It is possible that of course it could go wrong. So maybe like people use their incredible epistemics to like do horrible things, right? Because epistemics is a bit orthogonal to values, arguably.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, there's also a question of like what exactly we want to optimize. So maybe we want to optimize epistemics. Maybe we want to optimize intelligence. Maybe we want to optimize some other combination of like some index of a bunch of attributes of thinking, right? That just seems like the best one to optimize. Maybe you could find some index that's like pretty decent. So hypothetically, indices would be like a very reasonable thing to go for, but of course they get pretty complicated. Right?
Yeah.
So the next thing is like going for mass appeal versus narrow appeal. I think a bunch of people who have been thinking about epistemics recently have just been thinking about like how bad a lot of the fake news epistemics are. And like epistemics means we need to like stop people from believing fake news. which is like arguably some of the least interesting parts, because if we stop that, we're kind of stuck with what we had before, which would still be an improvement. But yeah, I think that like the current intellectuals just aren't that good compared to what we really should be aiming for. And that's one
Yeah.
reason why like a lot of what we've been talking about is much more the narrow appeal. And this is also to clarify, even within like so a lot of Less Wrong is actually focused more on mass. So it's focused more on like what are techniques that we can give to people where those people could improve their lives, right? And I think my model now is much more that, or the parts that excite me, but I'm sure like lots of it are interesting, are the ones where we have like dedicated researchers basically, who are just really great, and they basically tell other people the conclusions, right? It could be that other parts are basically part of the system, but they specialize. So like Wikipedia could be an example of like narrow appeal, and that there's like a relatively small group of Wikipedia editors, and the people who do edit Wikipedia are like kind of edit their specific part of Wikipedia, but lots of people read Wikipedia, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of like what, what I'm defining narrow appeal as.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think there's like some. Maybe this is just me, but I feel like there's some like year slippage here, where like you first define like epistemics as the EA course area, and then you like go increasingly narrow on the things you're most excited about. And I think it's like not clear to me whether you meant, focus area, whether you meant like this like version of collective epistemics as the EA focus area, or do you mean like of epistemics as a EA focus area?
That's a great point. So this presentation was written quickly, and as you describe it, it really probably should be split up into two parts. So right now, this is not the what I think the focus area should be. It's much more like what I myself am excited about.
Yeah.
But I think some of that is kind of saying, yeah. So hypothetically, maybe like it would be good to, when I post it online, I'll make this obvious. That's kind of like a two-part presentation, and the distinction is a bit fuzzy. I probably should have improved that.
Sure, sounds good.
Yeah, good thing to point out though. A lot of this is very speculative. I'm just trying to say like where my current thinking is. But I could totally imagine. So one great thing is that if we have better epistemics, similar to like what we talked about forecasting, hopefully we don't reify, right? And our epistemic greatness will tell us, oh, we should have been focusing, oh, we should continue to focus way more on the mass appeal, right? So if you start way too much in one area, like hopefully it could improve over time. You shouldn't be fixed. So.
Yeah.
So yeah, advanced AI. So arguably, this is Michael Aird's timelines. This was like the top one on one of the recent Less Wrong posts about it. The timeline tool was made by Ott, which was like, that stuff is great. Happy to see that. It's kind of an example of an epistemic tool. So one of the main arguments against like ambitious epistemic attempts would be that we'll just get AGI sooner. And that's definitely like, I think, a valid possibility.
Yeah.
But
small note, I think if you're doing like technologies against like AGI, a cumulative distribution function will be a lot easier for me to internally map than
that's a good point.
PDF. Yeah,
I'd agree
just
with that.
very small note. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, this is what they use, but I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
So I think the way that I'm kind of thinking about it is that we have a lot of space between us and AGI, right? So it would be great if, as we go about that space, we're able to use AI advancements as quickly as possible and as like usefully as powerful as possible, right? So it could be that we're just not smart enough to solve it, but if we use, like very, very weak AGI or like, weak AIs, then that will be enough, right? And in general, like what I'd like to kind of see is we have some very vague roadmap that like, as these technologies come out, we could do these other things, right? And then like, GPT-4 comes out and it could do music generation. And we're like, yes, perfect music generation. That's a missing ingredient for this thing. We could finally have a team go and do it now.
Yeah.
That's obviously kind of idealistic, but I think it kind of gives you an idea. And a lot of this stuff may happen very quickly, right? So just kind of, and then of course, it would be great to have ideas of what the index should be in advance, right? So it could be that if we try to improve people's intelligence, that could be like net harmful a bit. But if we do like intelligence weighted by humility, hopefully weighted by benevolence or something, then that would actually be net beneficial, right? So thinking about this in advance. and then like buckling up and getting ready to go with this wave. That's a high level strategy.
Yeah.
Now, one of the main arguments I've seen against this was that of kind of an efficient market. It's basically like, if there are great ways of improving epistemics, isn't this something that hedge funds and other groups should have been looking into? Like, why is it that we should be the ones? Like, why would we expect it to be like a cost-effective area compared to other charity interventions? And I think it's like a very valid criticism. I think to me though, like, yeah, there are a lot of reasons that this isn't as true as it appears. So first, just kind of being around the area myself, I think that things are pretty terrible right now, and we just have like a huge amount of room to grow, and I don't see that many groups working on it. I see like a lot of the engineering, a lot of the top tech companies focused on self-driving vehicles and like a few other big areas, but not that much on things that could improve our epistemics, even though I think that there are a lot of things that could improve our epistemics.
What do you think of Google search? I mean, maybe it's not like the best prioritized, but in a sense it is like an epistemic institution.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like would say that it's like that is epistemic progress, right? Like Wikipedia and stuff too.
Yeah.
But I would say, so there's a lot here. Another aspect to this is I think we should be thinking about some of this as internal tools, right? Like we basically have an interesting group that's very unusual. So Google and these other massive tools are typically made for large audiences, which have very different needs than our community does, right?
Yeah.
Or other communities. So I think making tools as like internal tools for our community could make sense, and then making them for other smart people and stuff, or like it may be that they help inspire other things. I think there's actually a pretty limited market for groups that are really trying to strategically optimize. So next thing is that we do have a lot of anecdotal data that it seems like people close to the community have made progress around epistemics that seem good to us. So like Robin Hanson, the whole like Less Wrong crowd, and Eliezer. It is kind of interesting that, for instance, like Eliezer and Less Wrong focused so much on epistemics or rationality, but then all the cause areas that are getting funded are ones of AI safety, right? Like I think it kind of tells you something that something weird is going on. Like it is kind of interesting that Eliezer and other people didn't really try to make the sequences into a textbook, and there's not like a rationalist.
Right, they did, right?
So they made it into a book, but not what I'd consider a textbook. Like it's not like.
I see.
It's more like a very refined series of blog posts, but it's still like kind of that structure, right? And there's not like an academic-ish institution trying to basically structure all of that and continue that type of advancement, right? Like a lot of the people in the area are going to AI safety, not so many of like continuing that strand full time.
Right. I guess another possible criticism is that maybe that tells you something.
Yeah, no, I think it's
like like rather than thinking about a broad efficient market, like there's like some narrow efficient market of people who thought about going into this or something.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a signal. That said, I mean, Robin Hanson is someone who's still working on some other stuff. Like he released Elephant in the Brain kind of recently, right? So yeah. And then like IARPA and Good Judgment. So Jathan Matheny was ahead of IARPA, I think, when it was funding, when it started with the Good Judgment project.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So we have surprising links to them. Moral Uncertainty, of course, from GPI. I worked on Guesstimate. So yeah, Guesstimate took me and one co-founder about a year, I think, maybe a year and a half. So it really wasn't that much time for, I think, the value that it created.
How much more uncertainty work can you really attribute to GPI versus this is work that Will did with his advisors doing his PhD?
I think that the moral uncertainty stuff is like stuff that he did with GPI. I'm kind of like connecting him, like he's part of GPI.
Sure, but like I'm saying, like how much is the institution GPI really like responsible versus he already did this by the time he was there, and then it was just like.
So the book that he published, I think most of that was written in the last like 2 years or something.
Right.
And then I think the one that just came out,
Yeah, I don't know. Does the book have lots of original stuff?
So even if it doesn't, it's a lot of work to write a book.
Sure.
and like put this stuff together. And I think it
Yeah.
references a lot of other people's work at GPI from what I could tell.
Okay.
From what I could tell, like doing something like that often takes, like it takes a village to raise a child. Often it's really nice to have like several researchers around, even if like two of them are the main ones writing, because
Yeah.
having other people who understand the material is actually like just very valuable and typically doesn't happen, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just like that.
yeah, that's fine.
There's like a very local question to me, which is whether I should read the
Yeah.
book, given I already read his thesis from several years back.
Oh, interesting.
And my vague impression from like talking to a few people, not like, I haven't talked to anybody in 2020 about this in
Yeah.
detail, so maybe this has radically changed, is that there aren't that much progress being made in moral uncertainty or something like weekly like that, such that like I could just like learn a lot from reading a book. That, but I could just be way off is the important thing here, given that I haven't even read the book.
And for one thing, it is free. Like I was like skimming through it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how much. Yeah, I don't know much about the deals. Anyway, yeah, Metaculus is also like made by EA's. Well, Anthony is like pretty close to the community and has gotten funding from us. Right? Causal app, the founder is a pretty EA, I think. Yeah. Rome Research has been like the wild success recently. And yeah, they've been close to the movement. I think Rome, like I'd like to do maybe like presentations or whatever on Rome in the future. That is just like succeeded beyond our wildest expectations, I think. It's possible that the Rome community and like basically the digital gardening community may wind up being like one of the most interesting things of epistemic progress in the next like 10 years or so. Kind of up there with forecasting. Hopefully forecasting also goes a lot faster, but that's another thing. PyMC3, so John Salviatir, probably pronouncing that wrong. And then of course, Ott has like started getting into forecasting in the last year. They seem to be making good progress. And then other reasons, so like one of them is that, yeah, I think looking back, all areas that require advanced knowledge and significant coordination are like commonly neglected or just like kind of done poorly, right? It is like very hard to do. I think my guess is like, there are probably a whole bunch of interesting technical areas out there that if you just had a few very smart, coordinated people close to money, they could do some very useful things for society. But it does require a lot of time understanding the material and a lot of like coordination ability, and very few people actually have that, which is one reason why it's neglected, right? Yeah, I don't think that the groups that are funding science are like fundamental science are like that amazing. It is kind of interesting that VCs get a lot of publicity and a lot of people want to become VCs, and that's like a very highly respected area. But a lot of the important stuff happens before VCs, right? And then the people who fund that, like I just don't know who those people are. I get the sense that there are these like more bureaucratic people, often people who are like very well respected, but that doesn't mean that they're actually going to do an amazing job. And it's like a hugely difficult job. Yeah.
There's a specific foundation, the Arnold Foundation, I think, that like that is spending a lot of their resources on meta science, which is a somewhat like touches a bunch of like epistemic development questions, I guess. I mean, it's like pretty narrow, like it's like replication and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, so a bit on that. I think meta science, I love that they're trying, but it does seem very narrow to me. Like if meta science won, I'm not sure how much I'd expect scientific progress to benefit. Maybe like a 2 or 3x speed increase, which would be very ambitious. Like that's a huge increase, but I'm kind of hoping we could do better than that. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then other things, like one is that even if something's not neglected, that means that you have the possibility of leverage.
Yeah.
So if there is like, and in this case, there are other people who would be excited and there may be money around it, which mean that like groups of coordinated actors who are who are pretty intelligent and like strategic may be able to do initiatives that help attract money and like engage other people.
Yeah.
Which would be great. And then an example kind of close to this is AI risk, which I think very arguably, it's not that EAs should be working on AI risk just because no one else is incentivized to. I think other people really should be doing it, but it's just not, they just can't coordinate, and they're not like quite close to the topic enough to recognize how big of a deal it would be and like exactly how you should go about it, right? So
Yeah.
I think there are good reasons to say that, yeah, it makes sense. Like the work that EAs are doing are valuable, even assuming that other people should be caring. Right? Yeah, so review, that's about it. Been going on for a while. So number one, worried about reification of forecasting. Don't want it to get like too reified before we actually know what we really want to be optimizing. So just want to see more discussion and like work on like broader views of what we care about. Number two, consider focusing on, which kind of leads, yeah, consider focusing on epistemics instead of forecasting. Like still think about forecasting, but think about all the things around it as well, and see if any of them are as cost effective or more, especially for like specific groups, right? Three, within epistemics, I specifically am more focused on collective technological possibilities. You could kind of call it epistemic futurism, depending on how you want to call it. I think it would be great to further subdivide the space, do more work subdividing it, and then saying what specific areas different people are excited about, right? Like what they expect will produce the most returns. And the space is arguably very big. Four, as AI advancements roll out, we should have a roadmap of potential technologies kind of ready to go. So like once these things come out, then we're ready to do these. And hopefully it's not just that we kind of know what it is. It would be great if we had kind of teams that were basically ready and could hopefully just like have things ready to be plugged into. It's kind of like a lot of startups start out before things are ready, right? So like YouTube, when they were starting out, it was incredibly expensive to host videos, I think. And like the business model wouldn't have made any sense if that would have continued. It only made sense because they knew that video hosting costs would decrease over time dramatically, which they did. So if you take it like a broad view, it works out. Similarly, with a lot of this stuff, I imagine we may want to get started pretty soon, right? And then like we kind of expect that AI will continue to improve things in specific ways, and that what we build now will be able to gain advantage of those improvements. So even
Yeah.
if they may kind of suck right now, it's like the future that we're ready for. And then five is that, yeah, there are different reasons to say that epistemics could be effective, even though arguably it is something that other people should be paying attention to as well. So yeah, it does seem like it's worth more consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I probably should have had another think about it, like areas. I'd say like if anyone's watching this video, first please make a message to let us know that you've actually watched it so far.
Yeah, please like, comment, and subscribe.
Yeah, and then like
I,
also
I,
tell us all the stuff that we did wrong and like how terrible all of this was and how shitty of a terminology is and all of that great stuff.
yeah. Feel free to do this in comments, or you could message one of us. Probably better to do it in the comments. Um, yeah. I think one thing that, like, I
Yeah,
think there's like something about, I feel like there's two other arguments that you can make for like neglectedness, but
yeah,
they have like competing or like different, very different, like pathways to impact or theory of change. One is that like you might just expect global public goods to be underfunded by default,
yeah,
or like yeah, like things that are useful for like spending trillions of dollars, like very few very few institutions, maybe like the U.S. government, really has like something that improves like trillions of dollars, right? Like very few institutions actually have trillions of dollars they're thinking of. The other is that like you might want to. The other thing is that you might want to give like more power, like more useful things to like a certain sets of values, or like for a hedge fund, this would be like our hedge fund wants to make more money than some other group. For EA, this might be like something like you want like the cosmopolitans for like the long-termist or whatever other sets of values that EAs have that you think are like relatively orthogonal to like empirical reality. Like you might want those groups to have like access to better tools earlier on. And I think both are somewhat compelling to me, but like they would like lead to like relatively different prioritization. Like for example, like how open source you want to make things, how like jargony you want to make things. And even within like, you know, you call this like narrow development, I still think there's a bunch of things within like relatively narrow stuff that's like will look very different if you're trying to think about how to create a public good versus how do you make sure like, you know, like the values that we like are the ones that are like, you know, statistically more likely to succeed or something.
Yeah.
Like a concrete example is something like a more concrete example is like as Steven Schubert talks about elite epistemics, like you might want like you want to create a public good within a relatively narrow range. You might like want like the top 1% or top 0.1% of thinkers to just be much better at reasoning. Or alternatively, you might want like the top like X% within EA to be much better at reasoning, and that would like lead to pretty different results.
Yep. Yeah, there are definitely a lot of questions here. One thing I was kind of thinking about is like maybe in one extreme, it makes sense for like there would be like an EA research lab that's like super confidential. That's just coming up with like great epistemic technologies inside, and no one else could see anything about that, right? I think that would definitely be a way to go about it. Some downsides, it would just be very expensive to do, and of course, you wouldn't be able to engage with other people. It is kind of safe because it's easier to go from like secret to non-secret than it is to go the other way, of course.
Yeah.
But it is like quite a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty confused about these things. It does seem like it's pretty hard to make progress without some level of openness or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to figure out. One of the also like huge questions here that I keep on hearing is like, you know, like it would have made, it is kind of weird that hedge funds and other groups don't seem to have published or like released that much that helps us make that much epistemic progress. I guess Bridgewater does. Maybe they're particularly transparent about it. But it does seem like there's some low-hanging fruit similar to what we've been doing and like what we've been working on that I would have expected to have seen come out of other groups that have existed. Like it does seem, it feels weird. It feels like there is like a strange void.
Right, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you want to figure out if they haven't figured this out versus like they don't want to release the information.
Yeah. Yeah, the world is weird. It's just like hard to
Yeah.
one I guess
One thing I've noticed that Jane
yeah.
Street people do seem like better epistemics on average than people from lots of other groups I've met.
Yeah. I mean, I think
And
that's what you'd expect, right?
yeah, well, to some degree, I think this is true for reasons other than like abilities that they had coming in.
Yeah. I mean, I think some
Yeah.
of that would be like cultural development or something, right?
Yeah.
Where they spend a lot of time like making sure that they have a culture that like rewards good thinking, like
Right.
correctness. But it is kind of interesting that like, you know, it's like Jane Street and Bridgewater and some of the other hedge funds don't like fund philosophy departments that are like focused on epistemics or something.
It doesn't give them a competitive advantage. Like I feel like this is just the obvious story there.
That would be an interesting thing. So this happens, like I was looking the other day, by the way, you could, right from now on, of course, we're going to go outside of the presentation. So if you're watching this, this will probably get more speculative. So feel free to stop as a good stopping point. And I forgot my train of thought for a second.
Yeah, maybe if we do maybe it'd be too hard to edit this in a video, but we could have like a few second pause.
It's, yeah, I mean, yeah, I won't, this is going to be a small group, so I don't, I'm fine just continuing. So, oh yeah, what I was getting at is a huge amount of education funding right now is coming from companies and corporate interests, right? It's like, especially for technical topics. So I think a lot of companies basically have monopolies. So for them, they just want to see, like they're basically getting, academic work is basically subsidizing the companies almost, especially if other people pay for it. So for instance, like there could be like some electrical engineering work that it's like obvious that there are going to be two companies who are going to benefit, and the companies will both benefit. And it's not exactly zero sum, because if it's good for, like, they're both monopolies or they're given like
Ecosystem,
areas.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, there might also just be like some like public relation, or like relatively narrow public relations thing. Although like that's not very persuasive. By public relations, I don't mean like consumer facing. I mean like future employees,
Yeah.
or,
It's
or something like the smart people here are uh, like the smart people here are like know the Google way to do things because Google funded like the specific projects, or like that are taught in the classrooms, and then like it's like an easier transition to them if they apply, or something like that. Having worked at Google, that doesn't seem super true now that I said it, or something.
also mention one quick thing about hedge funds. So I would like,
Yeah,
before I would have really expected that hedge funds and finance groups would have just had amazing setups of like predicting the future 20 years out. It doesn't seem like that's exactly the case.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I think so. Some things are, Jane Street is very short-term focused. I
yeah,
think Bridgewater is still like a year or two out. So for them, like having great forecasts of like who's going to win the election of the U.S. like 8 years out is not that useful. They're not going to like dedicate that much talent to that. Um, yeah, it doesn't seem like there are many groups who have these like bold worldviews all like forecasted and like estimated out many years in advance, even within these groups.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it's not exactly the same. Sorry, it's not exactly. I feel like a lot of finance is more about pricing than it is about like seeing the future or something. But like there's a sense in which pricing is
Yeah.
implicitly sees the future, but I feel like this is not how they do it.
And sorry.
Especially like longer term things like value investing is the thing you're looking at. It seems like a lot of like what Warren Buffett says he does seems to be. I don't know. I'm like talking about things I haven't looked into that much, but yeah, it seems more about like mispricing, like current mispricing, rather than like having a strong opinion about the future.
Yeah. I'd say, like, I guess one way to look at it is like, you look at all the things they could learn and how much money they would make from learning each thing.
Yeah,
And my impression is a whole lot of the things they could learn are just very industry specific, or just like specific to like how do we make financial transactions to minimize risk while like trying to do the strategy.
yeah, that sounds right.
And there's not much like, oh, let's figure out how incorrect we are as a whole on our like cognitive biases. Um, yeah, it's not so much.
Yeah, one argument for this is that it just isn't that valuable at a $1 billion time scale or like $100 billion scale or something.
Yeah,
And like on a
yeah,
trillion or $10 trillion dollars, it's worth it.
yeah. That seems. But also, I think for them, like the time scale is probably a pretty big part. Like I kind of wonder maybe
Yeah,
if these companies were maybe if they were operating on a 100-year time scale or a 1,000-year time scale, then they'd have to like figure out some of these techniques. Like then they'd have to be doing this like macro world modeling and like um, just anything that could accomplish those things.
how rational are VCs? Like I
Yeah,
maybe get the impression that rational, but maybe this is just I don't know,
my
way too
impression.
local. Yeah,
Yeah, so I tried selling Guesstimate to some VCs and it didn't go too well. A lot of them, my impression is that basically the specific process of improving your selection abilities is a rather small part of what VCs do.
yeah,
Like a whole lot of the decisions are kind of obvious. So just having the best brand and setup to like attract the best talent is very key. And just like having a good brand, so like blogging a whole lot, um, being known in the industry, and then like being able to raise capital. Those are things where there's a big difference between a VC's abilities, basically, and like reputation.
yeah,
So the specific process of trying to, make narrow decisions and like estimations of exactly how good different people will be or like groups will be, I think that's a pretty small part of the workflow. Um, yeah. Also, like one thing about VC is that it's just super random, right? So a lot of the top VCs, I think, did well from like one investment. So that's like not where you'd want to be if you're just very good at making investments. Like if you were just insanely good at like selecting things, you want a group that's not random, not one that is, right? So I'd imagine that like the people who are actually really good at this would be going into like more like day trading or like short-term trading, right? Where they have the ability to like their career isn't going to be like, you know, successful based on that degree. One thing I wanted to show that I think would be kind of nice, just like trying to explore. Yeah, I think this doesn't show much. Well, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
So I've been making like lists of things about epistemics in here. But
Oh, interesting.
yeah, like my causal pathway is something like, this isn't so much that it, about how epistemics helps EA purposes, but how it may help society in general.
Mm-hmm.
Is basically, epistemics basically improves our signaling abilities a whole lot. So for instance, like if we had much better epistemics, we'd know how valuable different academics were, and would know like how good different papers were, meaning that they wouldn't have to spend so much time signaling how good they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hypothetically. So like with a much better epistemics means that like much lower signaling costs. And then also epistemics, of course, leads to prioritization. So we could like know better what to do, as I've discussed. There's this concept of justified trust that I've started writing about, which is basically like what we need is both for people to be trusted and for them to only be trusted in cases where it's justified. Right? It's just like justified true beliefs, but for trust. Where if you only have people who are trusted, then you get like totalitarian regimes, right? But if they're also justified, then that's when you get like the epistemic improvements that you want. But if hypothetically we could have that, then that just solves a whole bunch of coordination problems for us. That'd be the argument. So for instance, like right now, there are a lot of things that people could do that would be great, but they don't quite believe it. So for instance, like people don't, hypothetically, people could donate to political groups that could help their interests, but a whole lot of people don't do this. There's very little money from most people in politics. But if they knew exactly who to donate to, then my guess is that they'd do a lot more of that, right?
Right. Like you have a representative democracy type thing where like it's very clear that like it's just like crystal clear that your interests are best represented by this person or group than any other group, and
Yeah.
like to the extent that there's like political disagreement, this is because like different people have different interests rather than like empirical beliefs or other issues.
Yeah, it definitely seems like right now that people are just like as groups, they're not coordinating well. It's not that like their interests actually lead to the situation that we have. God, I hope not. That'd be like a dismal state. But it does very much feel like people aren't coordinating. And one reason why they're not coordinating is that there's just like a huge amount of confusion over what to do and like what's actually useful. But if hypothetically that could become crystal super duper clear, right? Even just to a few people, that could go a long way. One thing here is that for EA interests, we don't need that many people. If we just get the top 10 richest people, that's $1 trillion, right? And then that money could be used to help get other people to be epistemically good or something. I think that there's a lot of confusion between those people of what's good.
Yeah.
So you could say that all we need is like for them to listen to us, but that doesn't sound very great, in part because one of the reasons why I don't think they listen to us is because the stuff actually isn't that certain. And it's like definitely hard to present. So if we could, use much better tools, then yeah. And then of course, tech development. I think tech development is kind of fun because like VCs, like I mentioned, it is kind of obvious to them, but tech development is one of the areas that's known as being high risk, high reward. The reason for that is because it's very hard to predict what is going to be successful right now.
Yeah.
Like a lot of money is wasted, but when it goes well, it goes amazingly well. And that does feel very much like the kind of thing that if you could improve your prediction ability, you could just do a way better job, right? Which I guess now that I say it aloud is like, oh man, maybe that's kind of a risk because maybe epistemics could lead to much better tech development, which could be bad for AI safety.
Yeah, I could see that. I'm also like, maybe I'm also just like kind of skeptical, slightly skeptical the type of things would be good at predicting, would be very good at like figuring out which companies will be useful or something, would be like massively successful or something.
I think So I'm not just talking about companies. I'm also talking about like products within companies and outside of companies. I think a lot of Metaculus, what it's been used for is for tech, like long-term tech things. So like when is self-driving cars coming out?
Yeah, I guess I'm saying that like
Yeah.
a lot of this seems like kind of like a public good in the sense that you don't really capture most of the value, even if you even
Oh,
if you
do you
have like
mean,
pretty good
yeah.
macro level information. It's like I'm thinking of like the people who like basically got like the internet right or something, or like the projects that I do, like they got a lot of the right predictions in some abstract sense, but they miss a few narrow things. And besides, like whoever created, like like Timbo, like I don't know,
Yeah.
people created the web didn't get much out of it, stuff like that.
So yeah, no, it's a great point. So for one thing, you're definitely right. But that said, I would say, even so, there are definitely people who do make a lot of money off of a lot of things, right?
Mhm.
And then those people could, if they could predict better, that would just be great for them
Yeah,
and for the people involved. Also, it doesn't just mean that VCs will choose better. It also means like the entrepreneurs will choose better. So they'll like start out with much better ideas.
mhm.
Um, and hopefully, for instance, like a lot of the crypto stuff that failed, I think really should have been predicted much more visibly than like people, the smart people kind of knew that it was going to fail.
Yeah,
But a lot of dumb money was spent on it. Hypothetically, the dumb money could have been spent in much better ways. Um, and then the other thing is like, if we could actually have very good estimates for how much excess value is created that isn't captured, right? Then we could have setups that pay people using certificate of impact type things,
right.
right? So if we actually could have a record of like, this is how valuable everything ever has been or is expected to be,
Mhm.
that would probably help us in a huge way be able to like allocate resources for people who want to do so for altruistic purposes, right?
Yeah.
Um, yes, it's a fair bit of stuff. Yeah, we've been going on for a while. Anything more? Happy to.
Yeah, this is pretty interesting. I should probably think more about stuff like this.
Yeah, please do. And maybe next time, if you want to give a presentation about your thoughts, like, or
Yeah,
another thing is like, yeah, um,
that would be fun.
anything else you have in mind? Cool. Okay, great. So I'm going to stop the recording, but thanks
Cool.
so much for being here if you've been staying with us so far.
Yeah. Excited to see the view count.
We'll see.